What is today's date? May 16th, 2023, meeting of the City Finance. Can I get a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Gutierrez is absent. Committee Member Harmon?
Here.
Committee Chair Friedman?
Here. All right, and before we go into general public comment, I just wanted, for the public that's in the room, if you are here to speak to either one of the items, please fill out a speaker slip over there and turn it in. The item regarding fees is the second item on today's agenda. So again, go ahead and turn that in. If you're online, I'll make an announcement when we get to that item on online public comments so that we can be sure to hear you from you there. So with that, I will go to general public comment. This is for any item not on today's agenda, but under the purview of the Finance Committee meeting. Of the Finance Committee, is there any member of the public wishing to speak to general public comment in the room? Not seeing any. Is there anyone online, Ms. Nicholson?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
Okay, I will close general public comment and move on to the first item today, which is the fiscal year 2023 third quarter review, and turn that over to our Finance Director, Mr. DeMartini.
Thank you very much, Chair Freeman. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Keith DeMartini, the city's finance director. I'm here along with Ms. Jessica Yates, the city's accounting supervisor, and it is our pleasure to present an overview of the third quarter financial review for fiscal year 2023. The objective of this item before you today is to receive a report from staff on the status of revenues and expenditures for the first 9 months ending March 31st, 2023, accept the interim financial statements through March 31st, and then recommend to the Finance Committee that you recommend approval to the full City Council of the proposed third quarter adjustments to fiscal year 2023 revenue and expenditure appropriations. The agenda for this presentation is to first receive an update on the general fund. We'll go over in detail revenues and expenditures and the impact on reserves. Next, provide a high-level overview on the enterprise funds, an overview of the proposed budget adjustments before you today, and then take any questions, public comment, and discussion. So we bring forth a quarterly financial statements and updated projections to the Finance Committee once each quarter. This is our third quarterly review with the Finance Committee in May. We've already done 2 prior ones. We also provide on the consent agenda for the full City Council a monthly financial statement update as well. And then at the conclusion of the fiscal year, we produce the annual comprehensive financial report, and that is scheduled to come before the Finance Committee in December. This slide here provides a high-level overview of the general fund revenues on the pie chart on the left, showing a fairly diverse set of revenues for the general fund, ranging from property tax, sales tax, transient occupancy tax, and other sources. And then on the pie chart on the right shows how the city is prioritizing using those funds, primarily for public safety functions of police and fire, as well as community services such as parks and recreation and library, and many other functions that are funded by the general fund. So now let me give a quick overview of the status of the general fund through quarter 3 and an updated projection of where staff believes we will end up the fiscal year at this time, given the information. So you can see this slide here shows the adopted budget of just over $184 million of revenues, 185 of expenditures. We had a budgeted deficit in the adopted budget of just over $1 million, requiring the use of reserves. Now, through 3 quarters worth of actual information, we've developed a projection which shows that staff is now projecting a slightly higher deficit, unfortunately, of just over $2.7 million. And this has changed from where we were about 3 months ago when we were before you with the quarter 2 report, where we were projecting a small surplus at that time. And there are really 3 main reasons why the projection has declined over the past couple of months, and they're noted here on this slide. The first item that's listed here is an action that was taken by the City Council just about a month ago to appropriate $1.1 million in the City Attorney's Office budget for the short-term rental enforcement program. As Council is aware, that program has no dedicated revenue to fund it at this time, so it requires the use of reserves. The next item is that the revenue projections, primarily for sales tax and transient occupancy tax, has definitely leveled off, and we see the impacts of that directly related to the storm events that occurred at the beginning of the calendar year, and so those projections have softened and have leveled off. Also, and this is actually a good thing, is that our vacancy rate has actually declined. We have been successful with recruiting, and hiring and backfilling a number of positions across the city that has ultimately has a cost to it, right? So there's additional expenditures being projected because of filling those positions at a sort of a greater rate than was originally projected during the year. So those are the three main reasons why we are now in this position of projecting a $2.7 million deficit. A little bit more on the tax revenues. This slide here summarizes some recent trends. Property tax continues to remain strong. It has been strong throughout COVID, throughout other recessions. We continue to believe that it will remain strong and see modest growth. Sales tax, as I mentioned, had some softening. The projections that we get from a lot of our economic forecasts that we have some information from is showing definite softening, but even some declining sort of trends in sales tax revenue. There are recession scenarios being evaluated at this time as it lends itself into, going forward into fiscal year 24 and beyond. And then finally, TOT was definitely impacted by the January storms, both from an occupancy perspective, but also an average daily rate perspective. The projection does assume growth into the spring months, which typically are very robust for hotel occupancy rates and TOT revenue. That is built into our modeling for the remaining part of the fiscal year. This slide here summarizes just a summary of where we are on our general fund taxes. Won't go into too much detail on this already since we already covered it, but you can see where we budgeted our tax revenues, what we've achieved to date, and what we believe the end of year projection will be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Yates.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. Good afternoon. So as for our expenditure reduction targets, as mentioned before, we had, starting this fiscal year, adopted the budget with a $1 million in expenditure reduction to balance. Some of this deficit was due to recovering revenue and because of increased costs to the city. Most reduction targets were met through holding positions vacant, which only compounds the issue of staff availability. Next slide. So at third quarter, which ended March 31st, 2023, we're tracking to be 1.9% under budget at year end for general fund expenditures. Revised budget represents the adopted budget, any carryovers from the prior year, and then any additional appropriations adopted by City Council this year. Reduction targets based on the adopted budget deficit discussed on the prior slide has already been achieved by many of the departments. A couple notable items to consider. Much of the expenditure savings throughout the city is achieved through salary and benefits due to vacancies. And then also police, fire, public works, community development represent a large portion of that. Fire, police attrition savings are significant, and overtime does continue to grow because of this, but departments are managing schedules to meet staffing requirements. However, overtime is needed to meet operational demands. Next slide. So unlike the general fund that relies primarily on taxes to fund programs and services, enterprise funds, they are also known as proprietary. You can switch sides. Known as proprietary funds are financed primarily from user fees and then all their non-tax revenues. The staff report, which is attachment, I believe attachment 2, this will outline further. So cost savings across the board are due to a combination of unfilled vacancies and other operational expense savings. The solid waste fund particularly, which accounts for refuse revenues received from customers, payments remitted to the trash hauler, and franchise and recycling fees paid by the hauler that are used for recycling programs, is anticipating a positive variance. As for the water, so the variance is largely due to MARG board compensation changes, salary and benefit savings, and some savings related to professional service contract reductions. In the water fund, due to recent storm events, there was a slight shift in water usage. Staff are anticipating a decrease in 3.8% rate revenue by the end of the year. As for expenditures in the water fund, they are trending below budget due to vacancies and reduction in expense related to the emergency pumping barge at Lake Cachuma. With Lake Cachuma full, the emergency pumping barge is no longer needed or no longer necessary to maintain the deliveries to the South Coast. Wastewater is also projecting a negative variance. However, this projection is a 30% improvement when comparing their revised budget deficit. Downtown parking, this fund accounts for the provision of parking services in the downtown area of the city. At Q3, actual revenues for downtown parking are approximately $7.4 million, or 69.7% of its annual budget. Service charges are still down comparing what is reported in Q2, and that's mainly due to difficulty staffing the hourly parking lots. But increased hourly fees coupled with minimal on-site enforcement has also been encouraging on-street parking, which is causing an impact. But it's also partially offset by the increased fees. On a positive note, there has been stronger business activity downtown. However, downtown parking fund is still anticipating a year-end variance when considering attrition savings. Next slide. So the Clean Energy Fund, which accounts for the cost to procure clean energy and renewable electricity on the behalf of the Santa Barbara community. So the energy rates of the program that customers are, that we charge our customers are tied to the rates that Southern California Edison charges its customers. Recently, Southern California Edison increased their rates both in February and are anticipating to increase their rates again in June. This will result in projected revenues surpassing budgeted revenues, perhaps as much by $9 million. Expenditures will also surpass the budget. However, the combined variance when comparing revenues and expenditures will be favorable, which will help this young fund's reserve balance. Over the next year or two, adequate reserves should be achieved for that particular fund. The airport continues to see sustained growth of commercial airline passengers since June 2020. Specific to parking, the parking program has grown to be a significant revenue source. Airport is seeking additional appropriations to provide support to this growing program. Despite rainy weather, which was an impact for many departments, the Golf Fund is projecting to exceed budget expectations due to paid round and concession performance. Waterfront, however, due to the storms, did feel the impact of January 2023. And the swell events, they had to act quickly in order to make repairs and clean up the areas. An emergency declaration was declared at a federal, state, and local level to help support these efforts. The waterfront and all other city departments are actively, seeking reimbursement to ensure that, we can get all the available funding necessary to help support that. Next slide. So as discussed, 2 of the 8 funds in this slide, downtown parking and wastewater specifically, are showing a negative variance when you look at year-end projections. However, wastewater does have sufficient fund balance to absorb the negative balance that we're anticipating, whereas downtown parking is projecting a deficit in reserves by year-end. Clean Energy continues to replenish its negative fund balance, as mentioned before, so we hope that within the next year or two, you should be seeing the opposite trend. Next slide. That brings us to proposed budget amendments. So this is attachment 3 in your packets. Some of the proposed amendments are shown here. Additional amendments are included in your packet. For general fund, there's a transfer out from the Community Development General Fund to the General Plan Update Fund, which is 1030, to resolve a negative cash balance. There's also a request to repurpose ARPA funding from COVID testing to the Employee Wellness Program. Other funds, reduce Measure C appropriations for debt payment for the new police building. There's repurposed Measure C for other various projects, mainly related to streets and paving. Streets Capital Fund, grant acceptance, and that's for various projects. And then the desal conveyance, it's a change order due to unforeseen underground conditions. The SB Clean Energy Fund, as discussed in the previous slides, and then to pay off the Golf Fund Safety Improvement Master Plan loan, and Self-Insurance Fund for other additional claims. So,
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Yates. We're just
Thank you.
going to, before we conclude this presentation, I'm just going to go back a few slides. Apologize. We jumped right past the general fund reserves because I wanted to make sure that the Finance Committee was aware of now that we are projecting a small deficit in the general fund by the end of the fiscal year. I would like the committee to be aware of what impact that will likely have on our reserve position in the general fund. So as council's aware, we have a 25% reserve policy target in the general fund. 10% of that is contingency reserves, and then 15% of that is disaster reserves. So by the end of the fiscal year, the target reserve policy states that we should have just over $42 million in reserve. With the recent projections that we have just communicated to you, we believe that the general fund will be below policy target by just over $5 million, below policy target. And then towards the bottom of this table here, we have a line here in regards to the self-insurance fund. As the committee is aware as well, we've talked about on a number of meetings, the city's self-insurance fund is underfunded. The actuarial recommended level has us anywhere between like $8 million underfunded, potentially, maybe $9 million. And so the general fund is responsible for a pretty significant part of the self-insurance fund being underfunded. So when we look at the reserve position in the general fund, it's important to note that the general fund is kind of on the hook for a portion of the underfunding position of the self-insurance fund. So let me just jump through now. I guess this slide's also important to look at the trend of our general fund reserves over time, showing about 18 years worth of general fund reserves. You can see how the city leveraged our reserve position during the Great Recession, during the Thomas Fire, steadily rebuilding those reserves, and then COVID hit. Definitely dipped into reserves as well. We were well below reserve policy targets before the American Rescue Plan Act was legislated by Congress. Those reserves helped us maintain our services to the community. And now here we are again in fiscal year 23 projecting using reserves again to kind of see us through this challenging economic time ahead. So with that, let me skip now towards the end of the presentation where we've concluded the budget amendments. This slide here, slide 22, shows a graph of the self-insurance fund. That red line on the bottom is the cash held in the self-insurance fund and what a forecast is over the next 7 or 8 years, given our current assumptions, and then what the actuarial recommended reserve level is. And you can see there is quite a large gap, and we have a commitment during our annual budget process to make some progress in increasing those reserves, but it is challenging because it is a big commitment to incur additional expense in departments to achieve an optimal reserve level. So with that, the recommendation to the committee is to accept the interim financial statements for the 9 months ending March 31st, and then recommend that the council approve the proposed third quarter adjustments for fiscal year 2023 revenue and expenditure appropriations as detailed in the attached schedule of proposed third quarter adjustments. With that, we'll take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. Not so good news, but we'll deal with it and open up to questions from my colleagues and questions.
I just have one small question on slide 21, just for clarification for the public, where it says street capital fund various projects. I know you mentioned the various projects for repurpose for Measure C. If you could just give me examples of the various projects.
Of course. So there's various projects. One is $30,000 for Measure C overlays project. So with projects coming in under budget, they want to supplement a project for overlay and paving expenses that were higher than projected. Then there was also allocating existing expenditure appropriations of $600,000 with savings from projects coming in under budget to the De La Vina Vernon Street Bridge project to supplement real property acquisition expenses this fiscal year. Another one is to move expenditure appropriations in the Measure C fund, so it's not additional, but you're moving. And this is for equipment purchases to allocate funds for new paving roller for ongoing production paving projects.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Not hearing any. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to this item? Are there any in the room? I think everybody else is here for the second item. Is there anybody online, Ms. Nicholson?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
Okay, so I will close public comment and return it to this item, and we do need to give a recommendation to go forward. So I'll just say I appreciate the work that's being done, and as we expected due to the weather, in particular, it's had a impact on the revenues that are coming in, and also that you highlighted that due to actions the council took to improve employee compensation, we're actually able to address some of the vacancies which we desperately needed, but then there is the downside on the revenue side. So these are things that we are managing the city as effectively as we can on it, but these are the outcomes of when you have more staff, you're going to not save the revenue. So with that, is there any comments, or if not, I need a recommendation for the staff recommendation, or a motion for the staff recommendation.
I motion to move staff recommendation.
Motion's been made. Is there a second?
Yes, Chair Friedman, I'll second, and I'll just say, second your comments as well. My appreciation, this is obviously not the news we like to hear, but super helpful to have this context and a big part of why we're doing the Vision 2030 project as a whole and have really been focusing on making our city sustainable. So thank you, and second the motion.
Great. Motion's been made and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed, abstentions? Motion passes unanimously. So we're going to go on to item 2, and before I turn it over to Mr. DeMartini, I am, for anybody in the room, please fill out the speaker slips and turn them into Ms. Nicholson if you'd like to speak. Most of you have already. And then I will make an announcement, let's say 35 after the hour, I will end accepting new online. So if you want to speak and you're online, please raise your hand by 12:35.
Great, thank you very much, Chair Friedman, members of the committee. The second item before you today is to receive an update on the fiscal year 2024 recommended budget. And specifically, we will be talking about a couple topics related to general fund non-departmental revenues, which are pretty much our taxes, and then a couple other topics as well. So the request before you today, there's a number of items before you today requesting an action item. First is to hear a report from staff on the general fund non-departmental revenues, including what are staff's growth assumptions and connections with the committee's review of the recommended budget. Hear a report from staff in connection with the recommended budget on staff recommended adjustments. And those are adjustments that come from staff after the budget has been released by the city administrator. And these are more technical adjustments, just changes of assumptions that are more technical in nature. Ms. Glusick will review those in detail with you today. And then we'll be asking for you to recommend to the City Council approval of the cost recovery and revenue policy that was presented to the Finance Committee 2 weeks ago. And then finally, we'll be asking for your final recommendations to the City Council based on the committee's review of the recommended budget and the proposed fee changes. So quite a few things being discussed today. So the agenda we'll go in this order. We'll first talk about revenues, then we'll go over the staff recommended adjustments, then we'll go over the proposed fee changes. We'll talk about the cost recovery and revenue policy. We'll then talk about where we've come from so far with Finance Committee. This is the fourth, I believe, the fourth public meeting of the Finance Committee on the recommended budget, and then reiterating what the request is to Finance Committee, and then taking any questions, public comment, and discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Parilla, who's going to go over the general fund revenue assumptions.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman, committee members Harmon and Gutierrez. My name is Salvatore Parilla. I'm the Treasury Analyst in the Finance Department. Today I'm going to offer you an overview of the general fund revenues. We call them major revenues. Before delving into each individual category, it's worth noting that although they are all different in nature, these revenue funds or revenue sources share a couple of elements in common. One is that they all are subject to the current economic environment, so changes in macroeconomic activity, and two, that they are sensitive to the business cycle. So you've heard of the boom and bust cycle, and Santa Barbara being part of the greater U.S. economy is subject to those phases in the cycle as well. So in the first slide, the figures that you see outline the current projections for FY 2023, fiscal year 23, and utilizing those and past activity and trends, also the projections for fiscal year 24 and 25. So the overall narrative here is that COVID-19 represented in economic terms an anomaly, and you'll see it on the charts that will follow this first slide, in that it really created kind of a vacuum in the economic trend. And therefore, as I will explain in further details, we'll see what the effects are in each individual revenue source. Next slide, please. All right, moving on to the first revenue source, sales taxes. Before 2019 and in general in the last couple decades, there has been a steady decline in the traditional brick and mortar activity. Up until 2019, economic activity was steadily growing, although there were signs of a slowing down, also reflected in the slowing down in the cut in interest rates that was going on before COVID-19. After COVID-19 hit, there was a very sharp downturn that affected retailers, and that reflects in the big dip that we see on the chart for 2020. 2021 represented a slight recovery coming out of the pandemic, and as one of the actual major consequences of COVID-19 and the fiscal policy that was and monetary policy that was implemented because of COVID-19, inflation burst up. Therefore, now we see for FY22, FY23, and moving forward, that those columns are way higher than in the past. The reason being that what consumers are paying is actually higher. So higher prices bring higher nominal revenues, not to forget that for the city as well, the expenditures are going high as well. Measure C, it's a sales and use tax. It's a 1 cent district tax specific to Santa Barbara. And it was implemented back in 2018. It usually follows the trend of the sales tax, although sales tax is specific to the point of sale tax that gets collected, while Measure C includes also the point of use. So if you purchase an item from an outside retailer, outside the city or the state, but you utilize it here in Santa Barbara, that will trigger the Measure C sales tax on your purchase. Next slide, please. Another major revenue source for the city is the property tax. So property taxes are probably the steadiest revenue source among the major revenues, and that's due to mainly to the price of the value of homes in Santa Barbara being steady and actually growing steadily throughout the years. We don't expect any major changes other than just the regular trend continuing for fiscal year 24 and 25, and of course a small amount of the property tax is affected by the actual sales activity, and specific to property taxes, there is that 2% kind of addition to the value that each year is kind of factored into these projections. Next slide, please. Linked to that is the real property transfer tax. So this is a tax that gets assessed at the time when a home changes owner. So when there's a sale of a home, there's a real property transfer tax that gets collected. 55 cents out of every $1,000 in sale value goes to the city. The other 55 cents goes to the county. Now, this chart, as you can see, reflects a couple of major factors. One is the low housing inventory that Santa Barbara historically has, but especially after COVID-19, where there was a boom in home sales, and also with the current interest rate environment being, pretty much in the opposite direction of where the mortgage market should be, which is lower rates. But with higher interest rates right now, pretty much the activity has gone down, and that's reflected in the chart for fiscal year 23. And we do expect a pickup in growth back in 24 and 25. Next slide, please. Moving on to transient occupancy tax. The city of Santa Barbara being a major destination for tourists and visitors. TOTs are a great source of revenue, and the chart specifically here reflects the activity that went on when COVID hit. Big dip, recovery in FY22, and then FY23 and 24 and 25 are reflecting, the projections are reflecting pretty much the higher prices that visitors are paying to stay in the hotels. Although currently, the high interest rate environment is actually causing the economy to slow. So we expect activity to plateau at some point. But as Mr. DeMartini previously mentioned, the seasonality here is very important. So for the last couple of months of the fiscal year, we expect pretty robust activity. Next slide, please. Utility user tax. So this is another steady revenue source, the like of property tax. It's a tax that is assessed on consumers of utilities. The main point that I would like to outline here is about the garbage UUT. So to align with current state legislation, starting in fiscal year 2024, the UUT for garbage will actually go away. That will be that revenue source is migrating, is being converted to the franchise fee paid by the hauler that is the city contracts with. So as you can see on the chart, the amount that you see in fiscal year 23 still reflects the current setup. So it includes the garbage UUT, but for FY24 and 25, that will go away, and you'll see it reflected on the franchise fee slide, which is the next one. And here we go for the franchise fees. So this is a tax that the city charges operators, utility operators, and for the right-of-way, to use the right-of-way. So it includes cable TV, electricity, natural gas, solid waste. So the trend is pretty steady, and if you see the peak or the spike for FY24-25, as I previously mentioned, that reflects a move from the UUT, the garbage UUT, to garbage franchise fees revenue. Also, please note that part of that revenue of the garbage franchise fee that the general fund will receive will actually, about $1 million a year, will be redirected to the streets fund. And that's all for the major revenues. Excuse me. Oh, cannabis. Oh, I'm sorry. So moving to the cannabis tax, so we do have 6 business licenses currently in Santa Barbara, and this is also a very volatile revenue source. There was a significant growth in FY20 and 21, counter to the trend of the other major revenues. In fiscal year 23, you see a slight dip. That is mainly due to one of the businesses reducing operations for this fiscal year. And for FY24 and 25, we expect steady growth, although it's very uncertain. Please note that also there is an audit planned for cannabis tax businesses scheduled in fiscal year 24. And moving on to the business license tax. So there are more than 16,000 registered businesses in Santa Barbara. So during COVID, many businesses have closed or recorded lower gross receipts. In January, the city implemented a new business license tax portal where businesses are able to pay by credit card as well, moving the annual cycle payment as well. So we do not expect a major impact for fiscal year 24-25 from this change, as all the wrinkles will be ironed out in FY23. And now, really, this is the end of that presentation. Mr. DiMartini?
Mr. Perrella, thank you very much. And before I call up Ms. Glusick, I have a couple final thoughts on our revenue assumptions before we conclude. It's actually more of an art than a science, developing these revenue projections. We gather a great deal of information from professionals in the industry. We have information from various economic forecast projects at major universities. We have tax consultants that help us develop these projections. We take into consideration local economic indicators as well. And so we work on these projections throughout the fiscal year up until the submittal of the city administrator's recommended budget. And we welcome feedback from the public and the committee in regards to our assumptions. Our assumptions are as realistic as we believe they can be. They are not overly conservative. They are not overly aggressive. We really try and hit the mark. But as you can see by looking at the trend of these sources, there is quite a lot of volatility in some of them. And so we take all of that into consideration. It's also important for the committee to note that we do everything we can to maximize the revenue that we get from our existing revenue sources. We have a very robust audit program on sales tax, business license tax, franchise, and UUT. We're looking to expand our audit program for transient occupancy tax and cannabis, and we're hoping to do that kicking off here in the next couple of months. Also, we have not assumed any additional revenue from what may come of the short-term rental enforcement program. It's a very high likelihood that we will see some additional business license tax in TOT. We have not budgeted for it because there's kind of too many uncertainties as we communicated to council when this went before you for your approval. So I just want to make sure that the committee is aware of that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini. Chair Friedman, members of the committee, and members of the public. As Mr. DiMartini mentioned, there is a lot that goes into the projections that our staff comes up with for these budgets. There's a lot of feedback that happens. You've already heard some of our departmental hearings, so you've already heard some of these proposed adjustments. What these are after the budget is released to the public, these are adjustments that need to be made to get them to where we're going to agree to adopt it. So far, this is what we've got. So for the general fund, and again, the general fund is fully funded by our taxes, our tax base, and other government-based income. So that's our public services, that's our fire and police department, that's our library, our parks and rec, largely funded by the general fund. Our fire department did make an adjustment, which they mentioned in their hearing, that we felt it was more appropriate to raise the potential reimbursement and revenue that we're going to get from mutual aid. Traditionally, we've kept it flat at $1 million, but in past years, it's been a bit more than that, so we bumped it up a little bit. The difference that you see up there between that $500,000 and the increases that are presented is due to some reassessment of some of their services and special projects. For the police, I have a little more detail on that on the next slide, but essentially this is revenue. This is not an increase in expense. This is revenue that has been reduced because programs have moved out of the general fund and into either creeks or energy and climate So we will go over that in the next slide. Parks and Recreation did a reassessment of some of their revenues, particularly those that they adjusted fees so that they could accommodate more use of their programs with people who are being subsidized. So they made an adjustment to increase their revenues with a positive impact on the general fund. Community Development also looked at their internal transfers and reassessed some of the internal transfers are what the departments pay each other for services, and reduced in fiscal year 2025 by about 70,000. So that was a positive impact on the general fund. And Information Technology also reassessed their internal revenues, including that a project did conclude in fiscal year 23, and so they will no longer be receiving revenues internally for that project since it's been concluded. So they had to reduce their revenues. And the total impact on the general fund is ultimately a negative impact of about $200,000 in fiscal year 2024 and $163,000 in fiscal year 2025, mostly due to revenue assumptions that are being reduced. Next slide. Okay, so as I said, we wanted to go just because police is a public safety issue, and that does look like a large number, just to give a little bit more color as to where this revenue reduction is coming from. So for part of it, our parking and street sweeping program is moving from the Public Works Department, and they will be paying our Sustainability and Resilience Department directly for that. Some of the funding will be coming out of the Creeks Fund. So that revenue that is moving between departments is going to move out of the police department because they are no longer going to be servicing that program at the same level. Also, the strategic ops and personnel, we have eliminated $100,000 that comes in annually to fund equipment replacement. That equipment is now being replaced under Measure C. So we are not taking that money away, we're just shifting the funding, but it does have a negative impact on the fund because that money is no longer going into the fund to be expended out of the fund. It's now going through Measure C. The reduction to the chief staff, where the funding is only going to be $300,000 annually, is also related to the programs moving. That's the street sweeping, and again, they aren't going to be providing the same level of support, but they still will be doing enforcement on parking where the designated areas for street sweeping are, just not at the same level. A lot of that's going to be taken over by Sustainability and Resilience at this point, so that funding is being reduced. And then the field operations, there was an adjustment from the general fund. That was a technical adjustment for $220,000 in each year. And the total impact to the general fund from the police department is therefore those $641,781. Next slide. Okay. So as Mr. Perea mentioned, our enterprise funds are not funded by our tax dollars. They're either from cost recovery with fees or other funding sources such as grants, et cetera. Our airport has a large adjustment. Mostly that was due to a technical error we discovered where when we did the upload, the fiscal year 2025 budget numbers landed in fiscal year 2024. So we had to adjust down to present the numbers that the department presented to the public in their budget hearing. So that was a technical adjustment. The remainder of that is after their presentation to council, they met with their airport commission and agreed upon a raised landing fee rate. And they also removed the replacement of a fire apparatus. So that's that ARF vehicle that you see in the news that they use for fire control and fighting at the airport. That was originally on our internal replacement schedule. It is going to be grant funded going forward. So they got a little bit of a positive bump from that. Our Gulf Fund also reassessed some of their costs. They are paying off a loan in fiscal year 2023, which effectively reduces their outflow of cash in the following years. So that had a positive impact on the Gulf Fund. The Streets Fund, that $24,000 of a negative impact to streets is the effect of moving programs to other funds. And those programs are, as I mentioned, the street sweeping, but also the rideshare program, which are going to Sustainability and Resilience. Our Solid Waste Fund reassessed its internal charges. We determined that they were inappropriately high, and again, those internal charges are what the city departments kind of flow back and forth to each other, and we're going to reassess that during the coming year to see what a more appropriate level actually is. Information Technology Fund, again, assess their internal charges. This is not the general fund Information Technology Fund. This is the separate Information Technology Fund that works as an internal service fund. So it gets paid by the other departments. So they reassessed their charges to be more appropriate for the work and support that they do across the city. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. And the Energy and Climate Fund also had a positive impact. Again, that's the net effect of moving the programs from streets over to energy and climate, mainly the rideshare program, but also doing a little bit of reassessment on some of their internal charges because they do some of the management of all of our energy in the city. And the Fleet Replacement Fund got $140,000 positive increase because community development reassessed some of the need of their vehicles in the coming year. And so that was the effect there. Next slide. That brings us to our capital funds. So all of the large projects that you see, a lot of multi-year projects around the city. We do have our general fund. The general fund and Measure C funds are on the budget book that is public facing. The tables that are there are correct. However, in the transparency tool, we noted that some corrections needed to be made to bring it into line with what we were presenting, which was just a technical correction. So the general capital fund effectively had a boost of $595,000 because that was on two separate line items and it should have just been in there once. On the table, again, it is presenting the correct number. On the Measure C fund, that $450,000 that I mentioned is now funding equipment replacement in the police department is on the table, but it was not coming through on the GL string in the transparency tool, so that is a correction there. The airport capital fund, again, that error that I mentioned where the fiscal year 25 numbers were flowing into fiscal year 24, that is purely a correction for that error there in the capital fund. The IT capital fund, again, reassess some of their internal charges, and part of this is the completion of that project, so they will no longer be receiving revenues for that project. And the harbor replacement fund has an interest revenue line that we felt was overstated, so we reduced that somewhat. Next slide. These are our special funds that have adjustments. So our traffic safety fund, again, that was the net effect of moving the funding to alternative sources. So the money that they were spending on traffic safety is now being funded elsewhere, so it had a positive effect. The City Housing Fund, when we did the original budget, there were some reductions included in the path and daytime monitoring programs, which we felt could definitely needed funding. We could not make these cuts, so we refunded those programs, and we are currently looking for other places to either cut or to gain funding in order to sponsor these programs. The Creeks Restoration and Water Quality Improvement Fund, again, this is where the street sweeping is moving into that fund for being used, and the net effect is positive on that fund. The airport special funds, again, there was that technical correction for the 2025 numbers rolling into 2024. And then there was some additional small fund balancing that needed to be done. This airport debt service, a large number, it is purely a mistake. It should not have been budgeted for. Historically, we do not budget for this number. It is a revenue number that comes in on the airport bonds. And it was entered in error. So it's just on the airport debt service, and it should not be there. And the information technology, once again, reassessing those internal revenues and also moving some activities to alternate funds. Next slide. So as we've mentioned, there's a lot of unknowns out there. There's a lot of variability. We do continue to monitor any kind of information we have. We take the feedback on board. We take direction from all y'all on council and on committee and from the public as well. We work for you, the public. So we do take all of that feedback into effect, and that means that we do have modifications. And we do continue to look for things that are going to have a savings in salaries, et cetera, that are not vacancies, because that translates to reduced services, which is not why we exist. And we're trying to be creative about attracting and retaining talent for the organization, and that's why we have our Vision 2030 plan. We're also looking at the drivers of our overtime, particularly with our public safety units, and trying to sort a better way to plan with those. You can't really plan for disasters, but there are other things like illness rates, et cetera, that we can take a look at and see if we can do a better job of that analysis. And SCD's employees continue to bring us observations and ideas. And we also look at how we are working with our current and potential partners in the community to do a better job to really guide us into a more sustainable and effective organization. So, thank you. Mr. DeMartini?
Ms. Wilczek, thank you very much for going over the staff recommended changes and technical adjustments. So now let's move into the proposed fee changes. So just a reminder that all of the fee changes that departments are proposing in the city administrator's recommended budget are posted on the city's website. The document looks like this on the right-hand side, and there's a hyperlink to it right here. It's off of the finance department homepage on the city's website. We have had 2 public meetings with the Finance Committee thus far to review general fund and enterprise fund proposed fee changes. We're looking for your recommendation today, and then it will all go to the City Council when Council adopts the budget in mid-June. This slide here summarizes the proposed fee changes that all of the general fund departments made to you 2 weeks ago. And then this slide here summarizes the proposed fee changes that the enterprise departments made to you last week. So this slide here summarizes the major discussion topics that the Finance Committee gave to staff during the last 2 meetings. So let me just summarize them here before you today. So the first item was for the Finance Department. There was a proposal to increase the utility billing late fee from $8 to $15. And there was a proposal for a new fee called an administrative fee, which would recover the cost of staff supporting utility bill payers to enter into a payment plan. We've taken the feedback from the Finance Committee during that session, and we talked with staff about it, and we're willing to not move forward with the new administrative fee because those utility bill payers that will likely need to enter into a payment plan are already late and will already be assessed the late fee. So if we still are advocating for the higher utility billing late fee of $15 to make sure that we truly are recovering those costs, but we are willing to not move forward with the administrative fee if the committee chooses to agree with that position. There was feedback for the Community Development Department in regards to balancing the appeal fee amount for participation in cost recovery. Staff recommends that we address that fee in a future fee study, so not necessarily changing the fee amount for this budget cycle, but looking into it in a comprehensive way with the next fee study that'll be conducted through the department. The next department where there was considerable dialogue and conversation was downtown parking. There was feedback in regards to the disabled parking prepaid card discount level, maybe changing the discount level. And then also questions and comments regarding the hourly parking rate and the subsidized period. And then finally, for the airport, there were comments and questions in regards to the aviation, commercial, and non-commercial activity permit fee amount. So when we get to committee deliberations today, that'll be where if you'd like to make some changes to the proposed fees that are before you today, we would welcome those comments then. The last item before you today for your recommendation for approval is the cost recovery and revenue policy. And again, this policy is being proposed under the strategic vision, Vision 2030 and fiscal sustainability, and really looking at evaluating our revenues, figuring out ways of generating more revenue, making sure that we are achieving cost recovery for our vital city services that the city provides. This slide here summarizes the major components and the purpose of why we want to establish a cost recovery and revenue policy. Really making sure that we are discussing all of the factors related to setting fees. What really is the pricing philosophy for the different types of programs and services that the city offers. What are the major cost recovery criteria? And on the right-hand side, you'll see the summary of the policy, which sort of categorizes all the different types of services and fees into these 3 major buckets, and what would be the guidelines, sort of the preferred cost recovery level for those types of services. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Those services that are just purely of individual benefit, really the goal would be to achieve full cost recovery, and then sort of ratcheting it down if there is sort of a public benefit or purely broad public benefit, then there wouldn't be as much cost recovery for those types of services. So finally, here we are today. We've had our 4 public meetings with the Finance Committee, and we've talked through many of these items in great detail. And so to summarize the request to the Finance Committee is to hear a report on the general fund non-departmental revenues, hear a report from staff on staff recommended adjustments. We'd like to receive your recommendation to the City Council for approving of the cost recovery and revenue policy. And then finally, we're looking for the committee's final recommendations to the full City Council, specifically as it relates to the proposed fee changes. That concludes staff's presentation. Be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini and staff, for the presentation. Before I open up for questions, just for public comment, if there are any members of the public in the room here who wish to speak, please fill out an form right now and turn it in. Most of you have. And online, this is your last chance to raise your hand in the app. So do so now if you haven't done so already, because I will be closing that out. And then also, if due to the discussion last week, there was a lot of discussion about the airport fees in particular. And so if Mr. Hastert, if you could come up and based on last week, if there's any new information that you'd like to present to the Finance Committee and the public based on the discussion and the public comment that took place last week.
Thank you, Chair Friedman, committee members, and public for the opportunity to provide a little bit more clarification. As I mentioned at the last meeting, we have a set of minimum standards that was approved by City Council and the Airport Commission. That's this document that you see right here. The minimum standard sets the minimum level of service that is required for different aeronautical activities on the airport. So you've heard a lot about setting a level playing field. It doesn't necessarily set a level playing field for all of the activities. It's really for similar activities on the airport broken into a number of different categories. So specific to flight instruction, aircraft maintenance, things like that, we actually have 2 categories for flight instruction. One would be full flight instruction on airport leasing property, and the other would be under the independent operators, which is what the fees that are presented to you today are regarding. We want to be careful as we go through this because of our FAA grant assurances that we're not subsidizing one subset of airport users from other airport users. And so that's where the fee does come into play a little bit, in that when we are trying to come up with cost recovery, if we set it too low and we're subsidizing that with other users, subsidizing the program for the independent operators, we definitely have to be careful of that. The fee is based on cost recovery. It's a new program that we're just putting together with the minimum standards that were recently approved. There's a few different things that go into this program. So it's the issuing of the actual permit itself, collecting the information that we need for certifications, insurance, things like that. It's also administration, so we're looking at potential software, other things to track all of these permits, or maybe utilizing software that other departments within the city already use. Enforcement, to make sure that we are following up on this permit process and making sure that it's being administered properly. But then also a training element that I just spoke with staff about just now. As we are entering into all of the new leases on the airport, we are really trying to address all of the community concerns for noise, activity, things like that. And so flight instruction is definitely one of them that we want to make sure we do an adequate amount of training on a regular basis to make sure that the independent operators are also receiving that same feedback that we provide all of our on-airport base tenants. And then specific to the independent operators for mechanics and aircraft maintenance, we need to make sure that they're adhering to all of the stormwater requirements and other things as well. So there will be a training element. I will say that the minimum standards is designed to enhance safety at the airport, to make sure that everybody has the right certifications, the proper insurance, and is doing business on the airport accordingly. As we mentioned, the fee, we've heard from the public, seems high in their opinion, and it was based on a best estimate for the first year of the program, and we will definitely be monitoring as we proceed forward with this program to make sure that that fee is appropriate and make any adjustments as needed. If you take a look at the fee on an annual basis, it does seem somewhat high at that $2,900. But if you break it down monthly, you're really paying about $250 a month to access an airport and conduct your business on the airport, or even a potentially a little bit lower based on some of the feedback from council earlier. The biggest thing I'd just like to point out is that we want this program to be a safe, successful program and incorporate all of the community concerns as well. We don't want this to just be a check in the box where it's, I've heard proposed $25, you don't need to do anything, just check the box to make sure I have my papers. We want this to be an encompassing program on the airport that fits in with all of the other operations.
Thank you, Mr. Hastert. I appreciate that based on the comments last week from the public and the discussion. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. If you could pull up slide 26, I think that's a good framing of the issues that we need to, if we have any questions here. So I'll turn it to my colleagues. Any questions? Member Harmon?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Hastert. Just a question about sort of how we would think about this if, let's say, a fee was implemented at whatever level, the level that was suggested or not. I mean, are you planning to keep records, or do we have a way to keep records of how many instructors came before the fee was implemented, how many after? So I guess the question for me really would be, like, how are we planning to solicit feedback about the fee and whether it's workable, sustainable, whether it's fulfilling the goals as you laid them out? I guess that's really just my big question. Like, when we come back in a year, how will we know whether it's been accurately sort of targeted in terms of cost?
Thank you, Chair Freeman, Committee Member Harmon. That's part of the problem with this program, is it's very difficult on the flight instructor side of things to track how much activity there is out there. So there's some tools that we can use with staff internally looking at patterns for flight activity. Flight instruction does tend to look a little bit different than just normal recreational flying, although it could just be somebody going out and having some fun for some sightseeing as well. And that's what makes this program difficult to even come up with that first estimate. So as time progresses, staff will be definitely logging the amount of time that's spent specifically enforcing, training, going through the records to provide much better detailed information in the future. And then along with that, we don't have a good understanding for how many flight instructors are currently operating out there. I have a good idea just based on what I've been told and what I see. And time will tell how many actually sign up for the permit. I'm actually only expecting for the flight instructors, that's probably roughly a handful of people is my initial guess. For the actual aircraft maintenance, that could tend to be a much higher number than we anticipate, just based on the larger aircraft that come into here that may have maintenance issues with crews coming in from, say, Van Nuys or LA or somewhere like that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair Friedman.
Any other questions? All right, so no questions further. So at this time, I'm going to open up to public comment. And Ms. Nicholson, how many online do we have?
Chair Friedman, we have 4 hands online.
So with that, I'm gonna, I'll leave it at 3 minutes, but I would ask if you can get it in under 3 minutes, because we do have some commitments coming up at 2 o'clock that some of us at council are scheduled at. So if you could keep it under 3 minutes, that would be great. But since there is some time now, I want to be sure that you all have your full time. So with that, first up, I'll go in the room, is Carl Hopkins, followed by Vince Merstick, followed by Ollie Opkish.
Good afternoon. I hope all of you received and were able to read my email. Since then, I have talked to Director Hastert and have made a few changes in my proposal. My understanding is that the permit fees are explicitly only to cover the cost of the issuance of the permit and the enforcement of the permit. The city business, I see 16,000 business licenses at $100 apiece. So I think that if the city can issue a business license for $100, the airport ought to be able to issue a permit for instruction or maintenance for $100. That then goes to what is the cost of enforcement. And there's 2 issues here. One is we don't really know. We have no idea today what that cost would be. The second is as Director Hesser pointed out, it's extremely difficult to tell whether when a lady or a man over here and I get in an airplane and they happen to be a flight instructor, are they giving me flight lessons or are we just going flying? And how did you know they were an instructor to start with? You can't have patrol going around checking everybody before they take off to see what's going on. So I believe that enforcement is essentially only when somebody gets caught, when somebody says, hey, Joe over here is giving lessons and he's not on the list. And why should all of the people who get the permit and play by the rules pay for the one who doesn't? So my recommendation would be that the fee be limited to the $100 that is the cost of issuance, and that instead, for the next either 6 or 12 months, the airport keep track of how much time and money they're spending on these enforcements and turn that into a fine for those instances, those very few instances that people actually violate it. If somebody violates it, they should be the ones to pay, not all of the people who don't do any violations and actually play by the rules. And in answer to your question about numbers, if the fee is $2,000 or $3,000, I think keeping track of it will be easy because there'll be one. There are more than one now, and a year from now with those fees, there'll be one. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, Vince Merstick.
You will recall that last week I spoke and I followed up with a written report, which hopefully you folks have had an opportunity to read. This afternoon, I'd like to focus on the airport director's intent to single out flying clubs for significant additional fees. Individuals frequently join together to pool their assets as a club to make aircraft ownership affordable. Such flying clubs provide an opportunity for people of modest means to enjoy the pleasure of flight. They are for personal use only, non-business, non-profit, and do not present themselves as a business offering flight instruction. Flying clubs currently pay $2,400 per year for a simple tie-down spot on the airfield. There's absolutely no rational basis for the director's intent to impose an additional nearly $3,000 in addition to that. A flying club places no additional burden on the airport beyond that of any individually owned aircraft. Please ask the director to explain why he wishes to impose such a fee. If he responds that this is needed for enforcement, and in addition that he has received complaints from a local flight school that it is not a level playing field, please review item 12 of my written report that I distributed last week. And I think you will recognize the flight school's claim is nonsense, and the director's response is totally inappropriate. As stated in my written comments, the proposed fee structure is a radical and fundamentally flawed departure from the structure that has been in place for many years and has served the city and airport users well. Please recommend to the City Council that the present tried and true financial structure be maintained with fees adjusted upward to account for inflation. This is the most rational approach which meets the needs of both the city and the airport users. And please feel free to contact me at any time to ask any questions. Use my email address, and I will meet with you any time to discuss in detail any of these issues. This is crucial for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merstick. Up next, Ali Akpish, followed by Karen Khan, followed by Craig Alexander.
Okay. My name is Oli Akpish. I have the pleasure of owning a business at the airport. We're a maintenance avionics facility. And after listening to last week's, I felt I had to defend myself and other maintenance providers on the field. One, capability-wise, We work on state-of-the-art jets down to 150s. There's not an airplane on the field that we can't fix. We may choose not to fix it depending on who owns it. That's our right. We can fix anything, capability-wise. Level playing field, our hourly rate is $165 an hour to fix an airplane. And that's necessary because we're an FAA repair station. We have liability insurance. We have employee insurance. I mean, we have the FAA as our partner in business. We have to have up-to-date manuals. We have to pay for them. That's probably $30,000 a year just for manuals. We have to get all our equipment calibrated, FAA mandated. The through-the-fence guys, they have none of it. Don't want to compete against them, have no desire to compete against them, and they should be able to be on the field. There is a demand for it, but they should be held to a standard. We've probably fixed 5 or 6 airplanes on the field that were taken other places, and then we get the pleasure of sorting them out and fixing them. Our rates go up. Our rent has gone up. Everything goes up. So the fact that people are upset their rates are going up, very little sympathy from me. That's what we have to face. We're in Santa Barbara. I can't compete with Santa Paula. I mean, there's jet outfits in Illinois. They charge $85 an hour. We don't compete against them, and we're swamped. It's the price of doing business in Santa Barbara. That's it.
Thank you. Next, Karen Kahn, followed by Craig Alexander, followed by Dennis Durenfield. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kahn. Craig Alexander, followed by Dennis, followed by Devin Durenfield.
Thank you, Chairman. I will pass.
Okay, Craig. Dennis?
I have the pleasure of being retired, and I learned to fly with an LLC. I had other partners in my airplane because I couldn't afford one. And I think that by charging, having people, charging for LLCs is ridiculous. And I think that's just, keeps people from flying. It would keep somebody like me from flying. And I think that there's a couple reasons. Why does the city want to raise fees? The airport seems to be running just fine. And I think by raising fees, you're going to eliminate a lot of little airport businesses. Like this avionics guy, there used to be a couple of them in the airport, and now there's only one. Well, I think that competition is good, and we need that in Santa Barbara. And I think that the same goes for the individual instructors. It would be a shame to have only one place where you could go for instruction. It would be nice if you had a couple of people. And I think that would be good. Competition would be good. And, by raising the fees, there are people that want to raise them because they have no idea what business is like. And I think that by, raising fees without, there are no restrooms or anything, it's hard to get your airplane fixed on this field. And it would be nice to have a little competition. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Devin Durenfield, Michael Tarabassi, and the last in the room, Terry Harris.
Hi, Commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm just going to reiterate what I brought up last week, which is the fee structure, which was to get a business license downtown was $150. Then you had your $100, and then you had your $250 fee. I'm going to put that in cement. I think that's what it should be for independent instructors. Right now, you asked how many. He brought up we have no idea how many there are. I will tell you there's only 2 right now that are here. That are independent instructors. They're listed. The other one has already bowed out because he's already given up on the expense of what this is. I don't teach more than probably maybe at the most 10 hours a year. So to pay $300 a day to use the airport to teach 10 people a year, maybe an hour. And when you show up at the airport to give a lesson to somebody, the first thing you do is you fly somewhere else. And you come back. So you're at the airport maybe 5-10 minutes at the most. You want to pay $300 for that fee? Does that make sense to you? Would you pay that if you were a pilot on top of what you're being charged already? It's going to force people out. So if that's what you want to do and turn it already into the ghost town that it already is, by implementing these fees and the day rate, it's going to be a grave mistake. And that's not a level playing field. And it'll be followed up with complaints by the FAA. That's just my position on this. Some people I know don't agree with me on that, but that's going to be what I'm going to tell you. If the 150 airplane owners at the airport are going to agree with that, they're not here to be represented today. So a lot of other airports, I showed you the fee structure from Camarillo, what they charge. I think it's a $35 additional fee on top of the permit. If you want to do a daily fee like that, that might be more palatable to be passed on to the students to make it more fair. But if you go beyond what the existing rate is, you're going to lose everybody because you're not going to stay with it. So you're going to have a ghost town, nobody else available. It's going to be a less safe airport from an instructor point of view. And other people, by the way, are going to continue to fly in from other airports to do their lessons here that are not subject to those fees. In Lompoc, Santa Maria, Camarillo, Oxnard, Santa Paula, they're all going to fly in here to do their lessons here, and they'll be going other places to get the instruction because they're not going to pay those additional fees. So it's going to become a less safe place to do work, and you're going to get less revenue from it from a fuel purchasing standpoint. If there's ever going to be a restaurant again at the airport, people aren't going to come to do that. It's just going to become more of a ghost town than it already is. I would hope to see more people than less. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Terabesi, followed by Terry Harris.
Hello, thank you again for letting us speak today. My name is Michael Terabesi. Just considering grant funding, last week I spoke about, LLCs and who's actually going to be subject of that, et cetera. Taking into account grant funding and where that actually comes from based on the number of operations. The more that you have, more operations that you have based on a given airplane operations per day, that's where you get some of the justification for grant funding. 30% of the airport, roughly, is funded by general aviation. The more that goes away, the more you're going to have to rely on other itinerant things, such as commercial operation. That's going to lead to more noise. So there's this healthy environment that the airport is currently under. As you start to shift those things, you start to get more towards the commercial operations that are going to be louder. So just factor in that grant funding, which is, I believe is into the tune of $3 or $4 million a year. I think total $6 million a year that goes to based on the operations of the airport. So something to consider. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Terry Harris.
This time I'll put the mic down. Thank you, Terry Harris. I'm one of the two probably registered mobile instructors, 37 years. It's my feeling this came up too quickly, that you, the committee, were presented with figures. I think a main flaw was that we didn't have an airport commission meeting to talk numbers. We all knew that the permit fees were coming up and would be discussed, but there was no meeting where we all were invited and given notice that let's talk numbers. And I think that I would like to see it go back to the Airport Commission and invite the GA public and let us propose figures. We're obviously going from 100 to 3,000. We're so far from a consensus that's going to make everybody feel good. Personally, I think Carl's suggestion is brilliant. Charge a minimal fee, back to our 250 year, what we're paying, and let the offenders pay fines, because you will find very few. And then I'm perfectly willing to present my logbook, which shows, when I file my tax returns, I report everything. So at the end of a year, I could show how many hours instruction I've given, how much money I've made. And, if the airport can show me that my $250 is not covering my costs, then raise my rates and I would understand. So those are my thoughts. And I do want to say, I do feel for operators like Oli and the school, that they feel they're paying a whole lot of rent, whole lot of expenses. But they also have assets to use. I don't have a desk, I don't have an office, I've never been allowed to rent an office as an independent. I don't have the comfort of facilities, I don't have a parking space on the field. So, we need to understand the privileges and limitations of this permit before we can feel good about the fees. And I would like, to take it back to the Airport Commission and let's talk about those privileges and limitations and run the numbers around. I think it's a lot to put on you guys because, airport operations aren't your area of expertise. Numbers are, but we have to help you with research the numbers. Thanks.
Thank you. Now we're going to move to online. If you could call out online, Ms. Nicholson.
First, we'll have Craig Arcuri, followed by Nancy Capone. Craig Arcuri, please unmute yourself.
Chair Friedman, council members, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Craig Arcuri. I'm a longtime Santa Barbara resident, homeowner, business person, non-practicing flight instructor, very active GA pilot, former airport commission chair, and current airport commissioner. I know the issue of fees for independent operators at SBA is a subject that has generated a significant amount of public attention, and I respect all opinions on the subject. I just want to take a moment to assure you that your airport commission has considered this issue diligently and thoughtfully over a great period of time and made the recommendations we have in good faith without bias. Further, as former chair and longtime commission member, I have great admiration for the airport staff, their work, and specifically on this subject, I feel the staff has and will continue to fine-tune fees as needed with fairness to all. So Chair Friedman, in short, and council members, I would urge you to accept the work we at the Airport Commission and the airport staff have done on the new fee structure and have faith that the staff will adjust the fees as needed. Thank you.
Next speaker will be Nancy Capone, followed by William McBride. Nancy Capone, please unmute yourself.
Hello. Hello, my name is Nancy Capone, and unlike everyone else today, I'm not concerned with the airport because I don't even fly anymore, but I am very concerned about the possibility of placing extra burdens on our disability community by raising the parking rates for downtown parking disproportionately for the people with disabilities. And this community has such a wide variety of different conditions. Some are visible and some are not, but they make accessing city locations more difficult. So please don't add any extra burdens by disproportionately raising our parking rates. And I am a Blue Pass holder. Thank you very much.
Next speaker will be William McBride, followed by final speaker Sean Sullivan. William McBride, please unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. Sorry, I apologize. I have getting over a cold, so I'm a little hoarse here. Hopefully, you'll be able to understand me. But, I'm the principal owner of Coastal Aircraft Maintenance, which I believe is the largest maintenance provider here at Santa Barbara Airport, being here for over 10 years. We lease a 20,000 square foot hangar next to Federal Express and, employ over 20 techs and admin personnel. We're happy and grateful to be here at Santa Barbara Airport and have been for many years. But, our lease, as at many other airports, requires us to maintain large liability policies, environmental coverage, workers' comp, large liability on our vehicles on the field, and obviously a city business license. We incur significant expense in order to comply with all these factors. And we believe that it would be an unfair advantage to allow outside maintenance providers to access the field and compete with us without similar requirements or fees. Director Hastert also mentioned an FAA requirement on this specific issue relating to fairness and the way they handle and treat outside providers and airport-based providers. Look, there's no perfect solution to this. And frankly, I feel the fees he's proposed are too low, but we're willing to live with this as a fair compromise. I would finally like to note that a large part of our business is we do remote, they call it AOG services to other airports in the Southern California airport area to provide maintenance services. And these fees are reasonably consistent with what other airports are requiring for maintenance providers to come in from the outside. Thank you for your time.
Our final speaker will be Sean Sullivan. Sean Sullivan, please unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, Sean Sullivan with Above All Aviation. Going back to what Bill McBride said, I too agree that these fees are way too low for what these folks are asking for. They're asking for access to an airfield for basically $250 a month, which we have a online database with manuals for aircraft, and that alone is $250 a month, and that's just one of them, and that's required by the FAA to even work on these aircraft. The business license, our business license is $600, not $100, because it's based on how many employees you have. This whole thing about safety that they keep saying, I know for a fact that there is no one safer than the maintenance facilities on this field. And I know based on what we have to have and the oversight from the FAA and our safety record at our flight school speaks for itself. I mean, this whole safety thing is really kind of a dead argument, in my opinion. Just yesterday, an AOPA article came out about the lack of mechanics. The work is there. The lack of mechanics is hard, especially in Santa Barbara. With us paying, just $6,000 for a maintenance facility a month, we can't afford to pay and keep mechanics on this field when people are working in hangars. Just yesterday, one of our own tenants was caught getting an outside mechanic, no permit, no insurance, and we had to stop him. And I let the airport know about it. This is not trivial. Safety is not a trivial issue. These folks want to say that that's why, they're here, that they're going to provide more safety, and I just don't see it. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is the final public commenter. So now it's going to come back to the committee. And again, pull up slide 26 because I think that's the slide that we need to start with. So we'll start with any comments from Ernie who wants to kick off the discussion. Member Harmon?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Well, my understanding is we make specific motions related to these changes, so I'm happy to just start with the couple that I have, and we can go from there if that works for you. Okay. Fabulous. Well, I'll start at the top then on the proposed finance changes to review the administrative fees related to the payment plan and just stick with the late fee. First, I want to say thank you very much to your office for hearing our concerns with that. I think this is an elegant solution that does not double charge folks that are potentially already dealing with challenging circumstances. So I support this suggestion, and with thanks to you and your office for hearing that and putting it together. So with that, Chair Friedman, I would move that we would forward to the full council the revised suggestion on the utility billing late fees as proposed by Mr. DiMartini.
Is there a second? Any comments?
Second.
A second. Motion's been made and seconded. I concur. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed, abstentions? Changes, passes unanimously. So now we'll go on to community development. And on that, it seems that that's just being deferred. So I think that's a pretty straightforward one. So is there any discussion on that? If not, do I have a motion to approve that?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, abstentions? None. Now on to downtown parking. So let's split these two up for motions because they're just to see where we wind up. But on the disabled parking, there was discussion last week about the 50% discount, and then also I know there was discussion about changing the hours, but I remember, if I recall, that was an issue that might be a little difficult on that. But is there any discussion on that? I'm in support of the 50% discount.
Yes, Chair Friedman, if you don't mind, I am also in support of the 50% discount, but what I would like to propose, if it's the will of the committee, is to include a hybrid approach so that folks who are visiting Santa Barbara who have disabilities can still access the discounted parking if need be, and we can encourage local residents to utilize this fee. I think at least for the next year, we can call it a pilot if that's the will of the committee, but I think to continue in both veins for now will hopefully get us to a solution that works for everyone. So I don't know if there's any discussion to that, but that would be what I would like to move if that's the will of the committee.
Okay, so we have that, and I know that there was a discussion on the technical aspect of implementing that, but again, this is, as you're framing it, we could get information over the year and see if it works and if it needs to be tweaked or come back. But any comments on that or supportive of it?
Can you be a little bit more specific on the hybrid approach and what that would entail and type of other needs from other departments?
Sure. So the change, as I understand it, is to allow folks to get the cards, the prepaid parking cards, not to use the kiosks to call. My concern with that is just there are people who visit our town who won't have access to those cards, and it seems like an added burden. I guess I can't speak to what other departments would be required, but it would still cause some of the issues that have been discussed by Ms. Clark. I don't know if she wants to come up, like the bottlenecks, that kind of stuff, but I think on balance, it's the best option.
Thanks for coming up, Ms. Clark. I was just about to ask you. You beat me to it.
No problem. Councilmember Friedman, Chair Friedman, Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez. The switch to a discounted prepaid card as opposed to the validation right now is just an operational switch. So it's just a way for us to continue to offer a discounted parking rate to disabled customers without having to involve staff in that transaction directly. So they would just purchase it through our office, which can be done either online or in person or by mail if you'd like. We can issue those by mail. We can have them available for pickup in the kiosks so you don't have to actually come into the office. They can also be recharged online. And so that was the proposed change. As to other departments, we are the only department that offers a discounted rate for disabled customers. So waterfront parking, there is no discount for disabled customers, same with the airport.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so I'm supportive of the approach to have the hybrids that the out-of-town can come in, or if you forgot your card that day on you. So if there's a motion to that effect. And that's with the 50% discount as well. Okay, a motion's been made and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Passes unanimously. Now we're on to the hourly parking rate and subsidized period. I'll just kind of kick off this one because I know I had raised a lot of questions last week of if $3 60 minutes as proposed by staff, or 350 and 75 because there are trade-offs. But I've talked with some individuals downtown, business owners and others, and I'm supportive of the staff recommendation. It's never ideal for this, but we do have structural challenges, and I think in the long term, there's a larger discussion on how we're going to be addressing parking downtown, and if we raise the rates too high, then we might have overshot the flexibility we might have in terms of offering other incentives and keeping the rates lower in the long term. So after discussing this over the last week, I'm supportive of the staff recommendation. Any other comments on this? So I'll move that one. Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed, abstentions? Passes unanimously. Again, that's for the $3.60 minutes. And on to the airport aviation. And is there any comments on this one, where we want to go? So I'll start this off. I do appreciate all the public comment on this. And everybody who spoke in public, you did exactly what you're supposed to do, is advocate for your positions, and I'm glad that we heard from both sides today. I think there is a little bit more to it in terms of minimum standards, as well as some of the training and other things that Airport Director Hassert mentioned. So I do think, though, as I mentioned last week, that because it's a new program and they were trying to get to the best estimate they could, that I do think the $3,000 fee is too high. So I'm still supportive of the $2,000 annual fee. That's where I lie. And then we'll reassess it next year. We'll have a better understanding and come back next year. And maybe even have it go back to the Airport Commission prior to budget next year, so that the Airport Commission can weigh in on how it's worked or hasn't worked. So I'd be supportive of that, but I won't make that motion yet till we hear from colleagues. Are you supportive of that? So she's supportive of that, and you have any comments?
Yes, I have some comments. First, I too want to say thank you to the public commenters who've come out. It's definitely highlighted for me how complicated some of these issues can be at the airport, and thank you to Director Hastert for helping to educate me since he started, but particularly over the last week, as you know, we've sort of been digging into this particular fee. I have to admit, I do very much appreciate the reduction. I think that's a great suggestion. I'm still personally struggling with whether it's really appropriately sort of targeted for everyone that's making use of the airport. And I know I spoke with Director Hastert about the idea of potentially a sliding scale, and one of the things that came back is that's really, really hard to implement practically. And there are just so many folks that use the airport for business purposes who don't necessarily maintain the kind of records that would allow us to implement a sliding scale. There's lots of cash transactions, lots of unreported transactions, and so I'm sensitive to that as well. And I feel like in some ways we're sort of in the middle of a lot of really complicated dynamics, both substantively in terms of how these programs are run and interpersonally. I mean, I think one thing that we've heard from public comment over the last 2 weeks is just there's a lot at play, a lot of sensitivities, a lot of history, good and bad. And so I just want to acknowledge that we're sort of at the intersection of that, trying to move forward and figure out what's best for our airport generally, and also for the folks who use the airport and the whole community, broadly speaking. So what I would really still love to see, and I realize this is hard, and I'm sorry to even bring it up again, but I can't get it out of my head, is some kind of tiered fee system. And I think that there has to be a way. I mean, I'm just thinking, sitting here, a tiered fee system based on gross receipts. And if you cannot prove that because you're an all-cash business, you automatically go into the highest tier. You know, I mean, if you do not report your income because you're all cash, therefore you don't have a tax return that we can point to that would be sufficient to allow us to categorize you in a tier, you automatically pay the most. It's like in parking, when you lose your ticket, sorry, you got to pay the full day's fee. I mean, to me, that seems like a simple, and it's the second time I'm saying elegant solution, but that seems like kind of a pretty simple solution, and puts the onus back on the user to say, if you cannot provide us with the documentation sufficient to prove that you belong in tier A, B, or C, then you're going in C and you're paying $2,000 or $3,000. And frankly, we should probably include $3,000 as a tier in that framework. So I guess I just, I can't let go of the thought that there may be a way to come to consensus here, and that I'm not sure that we've gotten there. With that said, I do think that this should be a conversation for the full council. So I put all that out there to say that that's really still what I'm noodling on, for better or worse. And I apologize and thank staff for the work that they've done to get us here. It's just something that I'm still wrapping my head around, but I'm happy to move this forward to the full council so we can have this discussion with our colleagues. I just have to give that caveat that I'm still not convinced that this is the right framework, even for a year. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. You know, those are all points I've considered, and I understand them. I also, in speaking with the airport director and understanding the issues with minimum standards, I have concerns if we didn't do this, the implications there. But to your point, I mean, this ultimately will go to the full council for discussion. So we do have an option. We can just not do a recommendation, or we could move one forward, even if it's split. Any thoughts? Okay. So I'll go ahead and make a motion on this one then, and then again, it'll reflect that we had a difference of opinion on here when it comes to the council, and all you will have your day at the full council as well to make your public comments. So you're only in round 2. So with that, I'll make a motion that we move the staff recommendation on that, but lower the fee from $2,000 to, or from $3,000 to $2,000 as part of that recommendation. Okay, we'll do a roll call on this, please.
Okay, roll call on staff recommendation to move the annual aviation fee down from $3,000 to $2,000. We'll start with Committee Member Alejandra Gutierrez. Yes. Committee Member Harmon.
Abstain.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion passes 2-0.
Okay, and then so we passed, that passes. So then we need to go back and if you could pull up slide 31. So we actually need to approve all of this. So we just did D, so, but we'll need to codify that. So if we could get a recommendation for A, B, C, and then D would be reflective of the votes that we just took.
Actually, Chair Friedman, if I may, can you also approve of D, because it will reflect the Finance Committee's recommendation of approval of every single other staff recommended change at the fee schedule.
Right, and that's what I was saying.
Okay,
A, B,
great.
C, and D is also in there, but reflective of what we just.
Excellent, thank you very much.
And then there was one other thing I wanted to, well, let's take that vote, and there's one other item I wanted to address. So if we have a motion for the staff recommendation, including the votes we just took.
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor? Aye. And there's one last item, because it came up, it's part of what we just learned in the first item, that due to our expenditures and revenues, and we're dipping into reserves this year, there is the policy, the reserve policy, that states that when you go into reserves, you have to have a plan to refill them. So as part of this year's budget deliberations for fiscal year 24, since we're going to be further in the hole on reserves, if we could give direction for staff to look at how a plan to refill those reserves and present that to council as part of the budget deliberations going forward. So at least there's that thought going into it, because we're going to have to do it anyways according to our own policies. Does that make sense? So I'll make that motion.
Second.
And any questions, comments? All in favor? Aye. Motion passes, and you understand on that. Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.